Welcome everyone to Catharsis through Art, Writing Trauma and Painful Experiences panel. I'm quite excited to be here today. I think this panel will be very enlightening and helpful for all our writers at Writers Hive. Here with us today is GC Pullman. Hi, Gis.
Hello.
His pronouns are he and him. He is an author from Long Island, New York, who specializes in science fiction and fantasy novels. He has a background in education and politics and works with themes ranging from the questions of divinity to the nature of sexual orientation and how it's viewed in society. He's independently published several novels and short stories. Then we have Justin Manzano. Hi, Justin.
Hi.
Her pronouns are she and her. Justin is a geeky author of geeky YA novels, The Order of the Key, and the upcoming Never Say Never. A freelance editor, she serves as an editor-in-residence at Right Hive. She lives in Bronx, New York with her husband, son, and a cacophony of cats, and can usually be found at her website, justinmanzano.com, or all the usual social media hunts. If you've looked in all the places and can't find her, she's probably off reading fan fiction. She'll be back soon. Then there is Taylor Vogt. Hi, Taylor.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks. His pronouns are he and him. He is an MFA student attending Manhattan Bean College. He's been published in an anthology called Tiny Tales through Run Rabbit Books and has completed several manuscripts as well. He attended Pace University for a honors bachelor's degree in political science. He attended the New School for a Master of Science. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2011. He considers himself bisexual. And at last we have Nicole B. Her pronouns are she and her. She is a technical writer and author who focuses on deep stories to dig into. Books that include romance, honesty, hope, and self-discovery. She's an avid storyteller since her childhood, and she has honed her skills through a variety of educational programs, including management, sociology, legal studies, and cultural diversity in the workplace. Most recently, engaging in coursework about communication for technologists. She loves books of all shapes and sizes, but has a soft spot for short reads. Protagonists with pets, and anything featuring ghosts or cats. When Nicole isn't busy updating her manuscript portfolio or catching up on her to-be-read pile, she can usually be found gardening, horseback riding, or perusing the shelves of a used bookstore. She and her husband share a home in Eastern Canada with a collection of multicolored cats and a lifetime's worth of books. I'm so jealous of your books. So for this panel, I divided the questions into 4 big sections, which are: what is trauma, catharsis, and art? Experiencing pain and trauma, writing, and the reader. Let's begin by defining some concepts. What is trauma? Can it be physical, emotional, or both?
Well, trauma is a deeply disturbing experience that you've gone through, and it can be physical or emotional. I know that I've suffered from surgical trauma, as well as the thing that you mainly think of when you think of trauma, which is usually emotional. But there are physical ways that you can manifest trauma. Yeah, that's the best I've got for a definition. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Trauma can be both like outwardly observable, large or small. You can have microaggressions that to other people may seem to be of a lesser magnitude than more uh, more oppressive and larger aggressions towards someone, which can lead to a personal traumatic experience that I think that we're sort of coming to terms with as a society and a reckoning with to address these microaggressions, these micro traumatic experiences that for so long were discounted because of the scale at which people from the outside would observe them or interpret them. And I think we'd be remiss to discount what someone goes through on a personal level because it is a personal experience, just because it isn't uh, consequentially earth-shadowing to someone else on the outside.
I want to piggyback on something Justine said about the issue between physical and emotional trauma. There's definitely a huge link between them. There are things that I'm sure we all remember that happened when we were younger that we remember because they were traumatic. And I think, I think they're combined, but they can have different weights. So one can be more emotional trauma, like if somebody breaks up with you in a very painful way, whereas a physical trauma like a car accident can leave you more physically damaged over time, which leads to emotional damage, but doesn't primarily exert itself on the emotions for many people.
I would agree with everything that has been said so far, which kind of comes with going last. I agree with the statement about it manifesting in different ways for different people. Even the same type of trauma or similar types of trauma can manifest and look different for different people, even if they're experiencing or have experienced some of the same things.
If I could just piggyback off of what Taylor said, when you're talking about these microaggressions, these are things that build up and become large trauma from series of what can be considered by others to be smaller acts that will snowball and can have a really strong effect on a person. It's not, even though it may, oh, go ahead, Taylor.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like you're right, 100%. Trauma can be snowballing, and it doesn't even have to be in a series of events that someone from an outside observer would say, yes, this is directly connected to that, which is directly connected to that. It can be over a series of years, be over a lifetime. These small things that could happen a day apart or a month apart or a year apart or a decade apart that just snowball and accumulate because the mind is this incredible sponge and it holds on to so much. We could just like defrag our brain in the same way that we do our computer. That might not be an issue, but the brain subconsciously grapples and holds on to things that we consciously don't even think of on a day-to-day basis until finally it explodes and we have coming to terms with all of the trauma that we have experienced over a given period of time.
What is art? And especially, do you think it needs external validation, like from an institute or academia, to be considered proper art?
Absolutely not. I think the modernization of the art industry, particularly like my background is in writing and I interact so often with self-published authors who, these are people who all their life have been studying, writing on a personal level and never even sought academic training or rigorous academic study. And they produce incredible works of art. There's always that art, that sentiment that art comes from a very different place than science or math or STEM technology, like STEM fields. Someone can go through life without ever setting foot in a classroom for an art-related activity and come out as a beautiful poet or a really meaningful novelist or really poignant short flash fiction, combinations of the two. And I don't think that it's really ironic coming from someone who's in an MFA program, but I don't think you need the nod from academia to be respected and appreciated as an artist.
I agree, and I think it's relevant too because just because you've taken a program in an academic art field doesn't necessarily lead you or make you into the artist necessarily that you want to be or that others will see you as. So I think there's an interesting connection between the two, but one doesn't necessarily always lead to the other as well.
I was going to say that I feel like what you need for art, because art is a very human experience, and we love, you know, observing art is something that I think is very personal to each individual. And I think all you really need to create art is to live life and observe it, and, you know, be willing to really pick it apart and view it in that kind of dynamic way, and then try to recreate that, which is something that, you know, you don't, well, yes, the actual grammar side and the craft side does need growth and does need work. The human experience is something that we just all share inherently.
I love that talk about the human experience. I think that's really a solid point, because I think art is definitely part of and a creative force for the human experience. I know we're going to talk about encoding emotions into artwork later on, but I just want to say that sometimes art doesn't have to have a purpose. It can just be something you do for fun, just to create something and enjoy your time.
Yeah, you know, like there's always that tried and true saying that art reflects life and life reflects art. And, you know, like, I hate to be too cliche and using two cliches back to back, but if you experience life, and that is reflected in the writing and the art that you create, it's easy to say that you can go through the school of life and come out the other end a proper artist, because you understand the world possibly, probably even better than someone who's spent, you know, 7 years undergraduate, graduate, sitting in a classroom. No, just through those experiences, just like Justine was saying, is so valuable to the artistic experience.
Yes, absolutely. As you all said, it has more to do with the human experience than anything else. And what is catharsis? Does catharsis equal to a cure?
I think when you take the dictionary definition of catharsis, or something being cathartic, it's sort of that psychological relief through the expression of strong emotions. And whether it's through art or writing or whatever you would consider that process in order to get those emotions out into the world, it's basically that process of feeling that relief, that psychological relief, through your own expression, whatever that may be.
I think that, you know, writing and visual art, screenplay creation, you know, abstract art creation, these are all things that we can funnel our emotions into. And this question has the caveat of, is it a cure? You know, just drawing on personal experience. When I was younger, I was very connected to the events of September 11th, and I felt that, you know, my world was inconsolable and chaotic and didn't make much sense. So I turned to the world of role playing and taking on a character and becoming that character. And I was a teenager. I started. I was role playing since I've been 6 or 7, but it really only mattered after September 11th. And I ended up doing a Teen Titans role play for about 5 years, where, you know, it was so important for me to have this character, because it was an opportunity for me to step outside of myself and through art experience a life that was not my own, and really grounded me in my real life, because I had this outlet and this cathartic opportunity to be a superhero, to have total control over my life, to 100% determine my future as this character. And so I think art, you know, there are so many people I know who I say, I've written 5 books, and they're like, me too. I'm like, cool, like, are you going to get published? Are you published? Like, no, I'm never getting published, because for them, it's a cathartic experience to just get these story ideas out on paper and get them down and get them out of their head. So yeah, art can definitely be cathartic.
I gotta jump in and just say, wow, another role player. That's awesome. Yeah, role play is definitely one way to get a good catharsis, to get your emotions out into the world without having to, write for a larger audience and or write for no audience. You get some feedback, but you get very limited, usually friendly feedback. And I grew up role playing as well. It helped me get through unpleasant years in high school and helped me get through all. 9/11 was definitely part of my life in that sense. I'm nearby. Catharsis doesn't equal a cure. I think that's the interesting thing, because all of these things help. I don't think they necessarily they don't solve things. They don't make it all go away on their own. So it helps a lot, but it isn't itself a cure.
That is exactly one thing I was going to say, was that that I feel like it's a big thing to role play when you're going through trauma. I feel like it is something I've heard a lot of people that I know that have experienced it do, as that sort of, like Taylor was saying, that sort of outlet where you have control, and that you can plot how things are going to go, and it helps to know that you're going to be okay in that kind of an environment. So there is that. And then also, as far as the cure thing, I 100% agree with Jesse, because I feel like catharsis is helpful, but I feel like emotions about an event that you've experienced in your life, they never really go away. Not in a final kind of way. And so when you could always slide back into that negative spot if you don't continue to forward, that forward momentum and that growth. And so I feel like we're, when we are pouring ourselves into something to try to we're examining that issue, and we're finding new ways to understand how we react and how we cope. But yeah, I don't feel like it's a cure.
Couldn't agree more with Justine and Jesse. I mean, it's not a cure, but it's kind of like a medicine. It treats the symptoms and allows you to just function. It's very similar to taking medication for mental health, which I have personal experience doing. You're never going to be able to cure what goes on in the brain and the chemical imbalances in the brain, but you can take medicine to sort of alleviate the symptoms and live a productive, happy, normal life. And going to the point of art, I think that art gives us a community, and going through trauma and trying to reconcile with it alone is a terrible prospect. And I think that through our art, we find other people that we can relate to and who have similar interests to us. And therefore, we can share our trauma with them as long as they are willing, and they can help us deal with it again, just like another kind of medicine. It's not a cure, but it is definitely helpful.
Yeah, I love that concept of catharsis as a medicine. I hadn't thought of it that way. I really like it. How important are personal emotions to make a good piece of art?
I feel like all art involves a piece of us when we're creating, even when it is the sort of thing that's really more for fun and not the kind of thing that you're doing in a very conscious way, as putting yourself out there. But I think you're always putting yourself out there when you're creating. There is an element of you in every character, in every thought that is written on the page. And I feel like there is no detaching that necessarily from who you are, even when you are casually creating art, because the way we see the world inherently affects us, and all of these things, whatever you've been through in your life or whatever you're dealing with, that informs how you see the world.
I'm just going to piggyback off of Justine because she's entirely correct. I think a lot of the times we forget that the same place where our emotions are housed, at the same place where our novel plots are housed, or our screenplay ideas are housed, or our poem prompts are housed, it all comes from the brain. I think a lot of the times when people see art, they think, oh, this person shut themselves off and for a couple of hours painted this masterpiece. Absolutely not. It's entirely the opposite. You know, all of your emotions are being funneled onto the page. It all comes from you. Even if you are basing your character off of someone else and you do a lengthy interview and they sit down with you and they tell you all about their life and who they are and where they came from, it's still your interpretation of that information. So, you know, to try and divorce emotion from art is like trying to separate, you know, oil from water. They're side by side and they exist pure together.
I really like that comparison of the oil and water and how that sort of relates to the emotion, writing emotion and having that in your work. And I think that's what makes it so difficult for, I can only speak obviously from the perspective of a writer because that's what I am, but that's what makes it so difficult to share is often when you're writing something that covers a personal event or a personal trauma or pain, that it's so internal, and even when you're writing it on the page, it's still generally a solitary activity to write, and sharing that content with someone else and being able to be vulnerable with someone else is something is it's a process that's entirely different than, I guess, just sitting and having a conversation with someone, because it's an art form, writing a book or producing a painting or writing a screenplay or something like that. So you're putting forward your skills, but you're also putting forward something that's inside of you that you're experiencing as well.
So I want to build off something Nicole said, and I want to tie emotions to effort. It's hard to work on something you just don't care about, because you'll either not work on it or you'll cut corners, you'll shorthand stuff, you won't put in the full effort that you need to really create the thing that in your mind you're going to create. It takes an emotional backing to put effort into something, because you only put effort into the things you care about. It's just like I used to tell my students, you know, it's okay to be nervous. It means you care about the thing you're undertaking.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I totally agree with Jesse. You know, emotions are an incredible driver for productivity when it comes to art. It's not something that you can just sort of like turn your brain off and go to a 9 to 5 and, you know, meet the requirements of the job. You have to be able to put yourself into it. You know, more, you know, my personal experience is I've known a couple of ghostwriters in my time, and I don't know if there are ghostwriters in the room, but I'm sorry for what I'm about to say. You know, so many novels in recent time have been called out and specifically said, we believe this is a ghostwritten work. And it discounts the novel because there wasn't that emotional tie to what was being written. It was a mechanical process paid for and put up online. And there's always going to be that hallmark, that trademark sort of stamp on a novel that is produced for oneself, you know, made with love and care and emotion and meaning behind it, and something that is a product of a commercial activity.
When you do disconnect, and this is something that I'm speaking from experience. So I have written a story. I mentioned surgical trauma. I had a spinal surgery when I was 15, and I had a really hard time processing the fear behind it, really, the anxiety behind getting, you know, your spine handled by a doctor, which is not a fun experience. It's a little bit hairy. But when I went through that, not long after, I had tried to write a short story about it, and my experience and my anxiety leading up to it. And the first draft was very clinical, and it was because I was scared to like engage with those emotions at that period. I wasn't ready yet, and it took time for me to get it right because of that fear. And it took years before I was able to really sit down and go, this is why this came out so badly, because it was just very like, and then she went to the hospital, and then she like just very stiff. And I realized that the reason why was because I was at the time unwilling to make that emotional connection to it and could not dig deeply into the way I felt. And so I wasn't going to be able to portray that because I just hadn't fully processed what I was feeling or why, or I didn't want to live with it at the time. I just kind of pushed it back. So in that way, like you have to, in order to create your work of art, you have to connect with it for it to be effective on some level. You may not, be digging in for a deep cathartic experience every time you sit at the computer, but you have to be engaged.
I'm gonna make a little quip here and say there's a reason why art isn't mass produced. You can't set up an assembly line to write a novel. If you could, we'd have multinational corporations producing novels every year. We don't. You have to have that emotional connection to, as Jesse put it, get yourself through to the other side. Because if you're writing something you don't believe in, what's the point?
Yes, absolutely. And the next question is directly related to what Justin just said, which is, can we tackle trauma by talking about it directly?
I believe we can. I think that we can. I think it's a good way to sort through what you're feeling about a certain thing if you're willing to be open and honest and not be afraid to face everything, because the thing is that it, depending on the level of trauma that you've experienced, it can be very difficult to sit down and dive into those feelings and connect them. But if I feel like if it's a real open and honest portrayal, it will be helpful, and it will, it will also connect with other people who have experienced similar trauma and who can relate. And that's an important thing to helping people heal.
I think writing in particular has always had a storied history in coding information for an audience. Fairy tales for centuries were used as a way to teach young kids life lessons without explicitly telling them the more harsh and cynical reasons behind those stories. I think that modern day, as we come to terms with things like racism, mental health, sexual assault, things like these, we can code in our fiction, code in our stories to tell why they are things that particularly younger people need to be aware of, and the traumas associated with them, why they are important to empathize with.
So as somebody who loves their therapy sessions very much when I get to have them, I look at it from two angles on how you tackle trauma by talking about it directly. I mean, the first is the fantasy world, the what you hope for, which is that somehow it will prevent you from further trauma. You share, hey, I'm in this position with my relationship and it's got all of these elements to it, and somebody says, wait a minute, pal, that sounds like a red flag for an abusive situation. Okay, trauma prevented. And as Justine pointed out, there's a definite, and I use the word commiseration, because when you talk to somebody who's been through something similar, when you talk to someone who maybe is just trying to learn about situations, it really lets you go ahead and just get along with them in a way that you can share what you're afraid of as well as what you've experienced, how the two are interconnected, and just in general, it lets you make progress on the issues that are in your conscious and subconscious mind.
I really like what everyone's kind of said and how they've put all the pieces together by referring to the topics that are like the bits and pieces that everyone else has talked about. I think that talking about trauma can be, like I think it was Justine who said, it can be kind of like a cathartic experience. But I think also engaging in that artistic experience as well provides a different sort of level of communicating that what's happened and what's gone on with you. I know for me, and I can only speak obviously from my own personal experience, But I did find that often starting out, it was easier to write about my trauma than it was to speak about it. I don't know if there was any particular reason for that, or if that was just something personal to me, but I did find that if once I started writing about it, then I was able to have conversations about it with people that I trusted, that I could be vulnerable with.
I feel exactly the same way, Nicole. It's like there's this buffer between you and the person that will ultimately read your work. And you also have this opportunity to not have conversations are great, but it's split second. It's not like you say something and then the other person says something back to you and you get 15 to 20 seconds to just stop and think through what it is that you're going to say. You know, when you're writing a novel, you know, unless you're talking to a therapist, when you're writing a novel, you have the opportunity to say exactly what you're hoping someone who's reading it will understand about your situation. And I think that's extremely valuable.
And in that same way, you don't have to worry about interruptions or snap reactions, like you were saying, or anything like that. It's you're getting your heart out there and explaining your feelings, and that they just kind of have to absorb that and have time to process that themselves. Like you don't have to worry about someone cutting in and questioning your experience, or denying your experience or anything. So that also lets you have that opportunity to be more open, because you don't have to be concerned that you'll be cut off, or if someone doesn't like what you said, well, they can kind of keep that to themselves. You don't necessarily have to deal with that.
I find it easier too, because for me personally, I'm a super introvert. So speaking for me is a lot more difficult than writing, and getting my thoughts out into coherent words and sentences is a lot more challenging than being able to, like Taylor said, like I can sit down and think about what I want to say. And if I can't think of something right in that moment in my novel, I can get up and go do something else and come back to it. Whereas in a conversation, I find that it's like that snap response, like we've said, where you kind of have to, you can't really sit there and wait 20 seconds to respond, because it sort of breaks up that conversation and it becomes awkward. And then you're focused on the awkwardness versus the content of the conversation.
How does trauma shape character?
Characters are simulated people, they're not real people. But when it comes to education, there's always this debate between nature and nurture. You know, if you have a student who is neurodivergent, they're going to have different goals you need to set and needs that you need to meet as a teacher in order to help them learn better for them. It's kind of what we do. It's a good thing. It's just how life is. But there's also concepts like sustained trauma, where over the course of years, even if it's from something as simple sounding as malnutrition, studies have found that there's concept called neuroplasticity, where the brain can kind of change and adapt to circumstances over time, and that's never necessarily a perfect adaptation, because in this case it backfires on oftentimes children who don't get enough food, so their brains don't fully develop. They live in a constantly stressed environment, so they're conditioned to respond with panic or violence, or I shouldn't say violence, more like self-defense, because that's just sort of how the brain develops over the course of the life. And you have to keep that in mind whenever you're coming up with a character, like how have their past experiences helped shape them into who they are.
I agree with what Jesse said. I feel like you definitely want to dive deep into your characters and make sure that you understand the elements of what they've encountered and what kind, because any kind of trauma can leave a mark in ways that we don't generally think of. People are defensive. They're nervous about opening up to people. They're, various things. I mean, I was mentioning my spinal surgery. I was terrified of hospitals for a long time. Just out of, and it's funny because as a lot of emotional issues go, you logically know that like the hospital helps you and that you, and I logically knew I needed the surgery, but in, you know, in that place of yours that isn't logical, it was like put me in a hospital to get like a blood test or something, and I was like heart racing, you know, panic. So these things are things that you can embody in your character, elements of that, elements of the way that the trauma that they encountered affects their lives to this day, and the way that, again, it's not always there's no logic necessarily, it's not something that feels like, depends, because like Jesse was saying, there are people who grow up in these situations and for them they're normal, that's their normal, right? Like that, to them that does feel normal because that's just the way they have learned to react. And then when people encounter trauma later on in life, or they encounter it in a different way, or it's not a continuous thing that they've grown with, that becomes a separate thing where you logically know that your reaction may be over the top, but it doesn't matter, you're still having that reaction.
I think that it's very different depending on the different stories. You know, I'm writing a superhero science fiction story right now, and my first time through, which had about 4 different iterations of it over the last decade. The main character was this stalwart, upstanding, not emotionally Teflon-like, you know, super soldier, and you know everything bounced off him. He was emotional. He was, you know, he led a meaningful life and fell in love and had friends and saved the world and all these things. But now that I'm revisiting it for my thesis, and then having come to terms with trauma on a personal level, I reimagined the character and his trauma, defending humanity from alien threats and slaughtering the enemies of United Sol Space Navy, have really worn on him. And now he is a reflection of how I would interpret depression arising from the trauma of being a super soldier sent into combat to kill. So I'm just saying that I'm not plugging anything. I'm just saying that, like, on a personal level, that's how I've evolved as an author, dealing with trauma for the character that I have written, where now that I understand it better, I understand that someone like him would feel it 10 times more than I would.
How do you think trauma should be approached with regards to character arcs? What can and what shouldn't be solved in the scope of story?
So not everything should be wrapped up in a pretty little bow, right? Like we have no one, like, I mean, I think I started this saying that when you reach this catharsis, you know, it's not a cure, right? It's not, you continue to feel these things. So what you really want to do when you're tackling a story arc is you want growth with the possibility of a change, like of a full change. But even then, it's, I guess I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but it's more like you want to see the character grow and move in the right direction towards healing, if that is the story you're telling, you know, assuming that is what you're talking about. You want to see growth in that way, but you also have to be realistic, because not everything gets handled easily. So I think what you really want to do is, I would avoid making everybody feel better and happily ever after for a situation like trauma. I think in other aspects of the story, if you want to kind of leave it in that happily ever after, like I know in romance, happily ever after is a big thing. It's a big element to the story, and so they, you know, there are different genre expectations as well, but you do want to show, as far as emotionally, that the character is moving in the right direction. If that's the kind of story you're telling, sometimes you're telling the opposite. Sometimes the trauma is getting worse. But I think in order for it to read in a manner that feels cathartic as we were discussing, I think you do want to start seeing the progress of a character's emotions and how they start learning to cope with what's happening. So in my just to add on, it's in my current story that I'm working on. I'm actually in deep in an edit right now, but the character is suffering from PTSD, and so throughout the course of the story, she's coping with that. And she doesn't get over what caused it. It's not solved at the end, but she's learned to still see the light in the world despite the negative. And so while it's a journey, it's not ending with her okay now. It's more of an understanding that she will get better.
Not trying to argue a different side of the coin here, but at least from my own personal perspective, the trauma that I've been through, I've come to terms with it. It doesn't haunt me on a daily basis anymore. I think that you can have characters where at the end things are better, things are reasonably manageable. I don't know if the trauma should be discounted entirely, just like Justine was saying, where it's like, oh, and then they ran off into the sunset and there was never a problem again. But it's more like sometimes, especially in the genre that I'm writing in, like the superhero genre, like people win, like the world is saved, and sometimes it's saving Metropolis, sometimes it's saving someone's heart. And you can write a story where, like, I am giving you the agency, Taylor Vogt, on this podcast panel to end a story where people are happy and satisfied and healthy and sane and all the things that we strive to do, because we're writing stories. If this was real life, we'd be making a documentary. And so
well, now I'm going to argue with you.
Okay.
But no, I don't disagree, and I guess that was you're making the same. I don't think we're at different points of view here, because I think that the idea is, while I don't think that you can like really nail that in between feeling. I was more going towards you do as well as you can throughout the course, and you can, I mean, people get to the point where they're not affected by their trauma all the time. And so when I'm saying, yes, you can end it where they're moving in that direction, or you can end it where they are now in that place. But what I guess I'm saying is that nothing gets wrapped up in a neat bow. And so while yes, the trauma may be over in the course of the story, we don't need to worry about that anymore. That aspect of the character, you've got to really get a good payoff to get them better. I mean, you've really got to kick that story into gear if you're going to manage to solve their problems over the course of whatever the adventure they're on is.
I think it's really an interesting kind of discussion, because I write a lot of stories that do touch on characters experiencing different types of trauma, whether it's emotional or physical trauma, and a lot of them stem from personal experiences. And I think that it really can depend, like Justine and Taylor are saying, on the kind of story that you're trying to tell, what you're trying to get across, whether the character is growing and moving forward, whether things are kind of wrapped up in a way that is satisfying or somewhat satisfying to a reader, or if in your genre everything kind of can become that happily ever after. I know for a lot of my stories, speaking from my own perspective, they seem to vary in what I write depending on the character. And I think it depends on what you get into with that character when they're when they're sort of speaking to you while you're writing, if that's the way that you write and the way that you communicate through your stories. And I think that your character often will end up having the capacity to tell you what their trauma looks like and how it will conclude, I guess, at the end of the book, and how the story should be wrapped up.
I think you're all hitting on some great points, and I want to kind of wrap them all into a concept, if I can. The idea of permanence with regards to character arcs, that when something happens to a character, that thing is something they're going to remember the next chapter, they're going to remember the next book. It's things that happen. So an example I use in this case is Mercedes Lackey's Foundation series. We're introduced to Mags. I think he's 11 years old when he's rescued from the mine he's being forced to work at. He's basically a mine slave. It really sucks. And all throughout all of the future books with Mags in it, and there are many, it's often pointed out how he's got a different way of talking. Like he can code switch very well, but he's got a very different way of talking when he's talking freely versus talking to the king, let's say. And he's also always noted as shorter than most of the characters because he was malnourished as a child. He was, fighting for every scrap of bread, and that permanence leaves something that can always come back to either haunt or give relief to that character.
Thank you. That's where I was going with it.
Sorry.
Sometimes I just need a translator.
So, how to approach writing trauma without the same background? Is it valid to represent traumas of other people, people that maybe are close to you, as well as those you don't know?
I think if you're going to attempt it, research. Take it really seriously, because these are especially, traumas and racial issues in particular. Talking about something that you don't have a personal experience with, cultural background with. These are things that if you do it wrong, you offend a whole group of people that do have those backgrounds. And so the more you can research, the more you can understand mental health issues and traumas, the more you can talk to people who have experienced those things, and get a sensitivity reader, someone who can sit down with you and say, this is my experience and these are the experiences of people in my community, and you're doing this right and you're doing this wrong. Don't just sit down and write off of what you see on TV. Seriously, take it, chew it over, and mull it over in your mind, and really do the work, because you don't want your story to be completely discounted just because you went the easy route.
So I guess the situation du jour is Sia's movie Music, which really apparently I haven't seen it, did a poor job and was universally panned for its portrayal of autism. And I think, as someone who's worked with a number of autistic people, it's interesting that, people are people. They're going to have their own wills and they're going to have their own goals. And it's hard to understand that without talking to people. It's hard to understand that without reading testimonials, getting information from experts. Sometimes as a writer, you might have to pay for that expertise, and that's sort of part of getting it right. Taylor mentioned sensitivity readers. That's a huge component, because people are people, and you might say something that is somewhat accurate but misses key points, and you, by leaving those out or maybe even injecting wrong ideas, you're gonna make people upset, and you're gonna actually cause them some harm possibly. So whenever possible, have a second or third or fourth set of eyes, and sensitivity readers you may also have to pay for. But if that's something within your budget and you're working with, especially if you're traditionally published and you've got an agency backing you, that's something that's really worth going after and getting done.
As Jesse said, people are people, and necessarily the reason why you want to go and try to get a few voices is because not every type of person thinks the same. Not every person who's been through a certain trauma goes through it in the same way and experiences it in the same way. And so you definitely want to be careful of miscommunicating how that works by just taking, let's say, one person's point of view, and having never experienced it yourself, you don't know that that's an uncommon way of handling it. You don't know. So you definitely want to talk to more than one person who has experienced that. And that can be a little dicey because some things are more personal than others when it comes to dealing with talking about a trauma.
So I'm going to say something a little controversial here. Making news in the Right Hive Zoom panel. But, there's nothing wrong with staying in your lane. Like we've all experienced so many things in our lives. Really take stock of what you personally have experienced and what you personally know. Maybe writing that story about someone else's experience isn't worth it. Maybe really digging deep and figuring out what you can speak from with authority and personal experience is a better avenue to go down, spending 6 to 8 months writing a novel than trying to extrapolate from other people's experiences. Even if you do sit down with them and talk and get sensitivity readers, you may ultimately create a product that doesn't reflect what your initial intention was. So again, like dig deep, figure out what you know, and then if you're not satisfied with that, then do everything that Jesse was talking about. Go out and talk to people. That's just my advice.
I was kind of going to say something along the same lines as Taylor, but he's more brave than I am to sort of get that down in front of the people that are watching. But I do agree that sometimes it's a matter of, is this really your story to tell? And is this something that should be left to someone who's experienced that to tell, or is this something that you can research and portray appropriately? And I think in a lot of cases, or at least in a good chunk of cases, often it's not that person's story to tell, it's someone else's story to tell.
I agree with what you were all saying. I was sort of giving the kind of advice of what to do if you have done it already, or if you are going to do it. But yeah, I think it is okay for you to choose not to write that story, and to leave it to the people who do really intimately understand. But there is also the fact that, I hear the counterpoint, if we're going by Twitter buzz all the time, to something like that, is that, oh, but you want diversity in stories. So how can we be diverse if we're only staying in our lane? But the thing is, you can be. You can include characters to the best of your understanding as the friends of the main character and not tell their story for them. You can have other characters who look differently and behave differently from you, without taking the story away from other people. And normalize that. Normalize side characters that have disabilities, or side characters of other races, and give them robust stories, rather than just try to take over someone else's tale that's theirs to tell.
And then if we want to flip it again with the Twitter responses, it would be like, well, what you're doing is you're flooding the market with books that are going to make it impossible for the person who is using their own voices to find a traditional publishing outlet like an agent or a publishing house. It's a hard thing. It's not easy. I mean, these discussions, we wouldn't still be having these discussions years and years and years later if they weren't hard to talk about. But the point that we're talking about them means that they're meaningful, and that we should continue to have these conversations, and that we should do things like research, that we should do things like seeking sensitivity readers, that we should do things like seeking out people in communities and the communities themselves to solve the issues that we need to solve, so that we can all, conscientiously and meaningfully contribute to the discussion and the promotion. Like, again, like another Twitter thing is, if you don't, it was just like what Justine was saying, if you don't encourage people to write these characters, you are invalidating them as even existing. It's such a, it's a hard sea to navigate, but I feel like once we as a community figure this out, we're going to reach a really nice island somewhere in that ocean. It's going to be great for everyone involved.
It's quite controversial, but I love everything you said. I agree. Well, we are almost out of time. So to wrap this up, I want to ask you if there are any resources you'd like to recommend our writers for writing different kinds of trauma or craft in general, if writing trauma books don't come up.
I'm short on resources on this. I think that's because a lot of times when you're looking for people's traumatic experiences, they share those things more privately. But there are some good resources. I'm not sure if it's still in publication, but there was a magazine called You and Me. I think it's youandmemagazine.com, and they have people tell their medical stories, either their own or like their experience as a caretaker. And that's one thing where, you know, I wrote a short story about what it was like to grow up with asthma, because I grew up with asthma, and it was at times pretty traumatizing. And that's just one resource. But my suggestion overall is, and another one, if you're looking into something historical, like a historical trauma or something, try the local historical society. They might have interviews you can watch if they've been tape recorded. So that's another possible place to get information on where to start, where to go, what you need to know about the background of a situation. Yeah.
I don't actually have any resources on writing trauma short of doing, read books on but written by people who have experienced these trauma, these different types of trauma, and really, like I said, you definitely want to do your research and make sure you know. But as far as writing your own trauma, I would suggest The Emotion Thesaurus by Angela Ackerman is a nice way of finding the words, because a lot of times I can understand the emotion, but I have a hard time like finding the proper way of describing it. And that I think is a really good resource. Actually, any of the thesauruses that Angela Ackerman writes, because they're all very interesting. And there are a few of them. I'm trying to think of the other names right now, but the emotion one is the main one coming to my mind right now. But it's just a good way of finding the words to put your thoughts out there, because sometimes those descriptions, well, yeah, you do want to try to not choose other people's descriptions for your feelings. They might help like send you in the right direction. So it's a nice tool to have.
I'm a big fan of the website Fiverr. I know a lot of people, when they get proposed with the idea of like finding a sensitivity reader, they go, well, where can I find one? I'm looking at a page with at least 30 different sensitivity readers who you can hire for less than $50 to take a look at your manuscript or explain your manuscript to them, and they will give you feedback and meaningful advice. And they'll have their own voices and their own backgrounds, and so that's out there, and that is a resource that I think you should take advantage of.
I don't really have any great resources either for writing trauma, but I do know that if I've sort of been connected with a press and a magazine, a lit magazine called Blanket Sea, and they focus on writing for and putting together stories and poetry, and I think they do creative nonfiction for people who are I can't say it, neurodivergent and have mental health issues or difficulties, or have experienced trauma or things like that in their life. So that is not necessarily a resource, but something that I know people could look at if they were interested in having, in writing something and potentially having it published. Also, I had to look it up on my phone, The Writer's Guide to Character Emotion, which is, I think, is the book that I recommend to people the most after the Emotion Thesaurus, because it really talks about writing in a deep point of view and really connecting with your characters and allowing them to connect with your readers as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for your time and your thoughts. I love this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.
You're welcome.
Thank you.